Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and start. So welcome to chapter 21, constructing and using phylogenies. You're wondering, what is a phylogeny? A phylogeny is the ordinary history of a relationship among organisms. And different methods to figure we can use morphology. We can use molecular sequences. So DNA, RNA, or amino acids. Or we can use even as a type of data to help in evolutionary relationships. Whoops. So what we call genetics is the study of phylogeny. So study of relationships among organisms. And we usually use a branching diagram, phylogenetic tree, which is a graphical representation that reconstructs the evolutionary history of those relationships. So in a phylogenetic tree like the one in this picture, my little pointer out. The line, right, that we see here represent a lineage. So if we see a box here, right, this little box represents either a species, a population, or at a single point in time. And basically this line is trying to say we are following the line of descendants through time, parents, offspring, parents, offspring, parents, offspring. So this line is showing us that lineage of that species, population, or gene, following its descendants through time. And we might go along for thousands or millions of years, not changing very much, just having offspring, descendants, parents, offspring, descendants through time. That's a lineage. But what can sometimes happen is a split can occur, where a lineage splits into two different lineages, right? We have some kind of reproductive isolation happening that splinters this into two subpopulations, and these subpopulations speciate into different species. So we would then refer to this lineage as the ancestral lineage, and these as the descendant lineages. Now, I said species, we could also be talking about changes in genes or changes in populations, or changes in larger groupings like phyla. In any case, I'm going to say species because it's kind of easier to wrap our head around. So we have this species through time, a lineage, and it splits into two different species, descendant lineages. So I'm going to write that. A split is where an ancestral lineage becomes two descendant lineages. And then what happens is these descendant lineages evolve independently of each other, and different traits arise. through natural selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, all the different mechanisms that can cause different traits to arise. And when you see these little dots, these little red dots here and here, those are indicative of different traits. And so we end up with this branching diagram as the lineage continues to split and new traits emerge, and we split again and we split again. And we eventually get this figure we call the phylogenetic tree that shows, it's kind of like a family tree, except for instead of just looking at relationships in a family, we're looking at relationships of groups of organisms through evolutionary time. So let's go over a little bit of tree taxonomy. So a few terms you should know. So trees have what we call the root. So the root of the tree is the ancestral lineage. So the root is the common ancestor of all groups displayed in the tree. And what we call a branch point, also referred to as a node, is where a lineage diverges. So if we're talking about a species, there'd be a speciation event. So in this node here, where we're branching, that's called the node, and there's some kind of speciation event there. What we would call a basal taxon is a lineage that evolved from the common ancestor of the tree early and remains unbranched. Okay, so evolved early from ancestor and remains unbranched. In other words, unchanged through evolutionary time. So taxon G would be our basal taxon here. It evolved early in, it was part of this initial split, and one lineage gave rise to all these different taxa, and in this lineage it remained pretty much unchanged, and we would refer to this as the basal taxon. And this basal taxon will be important later when we want to kind of work on making our own trees, because it serves as an important basis of comparison. So that is the basal taxon. And by the way, when I say taxon or taxa, I'm going to switch pens here because my pen is getting kind of low on ink. So when I say taxon or taxa, that would be the plural, I'm talking about a group of organisms at any taxonomic rank. Right, so it could be species, it could be phyla, it could even be domain. Well, obviously this isn't domain because there's too many of them, but it could be any taxonomic rank. That's what we mean by taxon or taxa. So what we would call sister taxa are the two taxa that are each other's closest relatives on the tree. So in this example, taxon B and C are sister taxa. How do I know? Because they share the most recent common ancestor. Right? Taxon B and taxon A are also related to each other, but you have to go further back in evolutionary time to see their common ancestor. Right? So when we look at an evolutionary tree, we don't care about how they're lined up here necessarily, right? Because taxon C and D are next to each other doesn't mean anything, right? What we need to do is look back in the tree and say, how recently do they share a common ancestor? That tells us how closely related they actually are to each other. Sometimes in trees we see what's called a polytomy, which is what you see right here, this kind of trident situation here. And this is an unresolved pattern of divergence. So what's going on here is we're not sure. We're not sure exactly the relationship here, and this is not ideal. This reflects a lack of information and something we still need to figure out. One of the things that's interesting and good to know about these phylogenetic trees, because of the way they're constructed, because of the way we're always looking back to the most recent common ancestor to determine how closely related things are, you can flip. So you can rotate any branches around their nodes. So you could flip the chimpanzee and the human around, and it still is telling us the same information. It doesn't change the meaning of the tree whatsoever, because again, the way we read them is to go backwards and look at the most recent common ancestor. So let's think about doing this. How do we actually put together one of these phylogenetic trees? Well, the most useful way to do this is to use what's called the cladistic approach. So the cladistic approach, or the cladistics, is a method to determine relatedness by forming clades. And in particular, what we want is what's called a monophyletic clade. So a monophyletic clade is all descendants in a group plus their common ancestor. So let's look at this tree here. So chimpanzees and humans, this area right here, this would be a monophyletic clade. We've got the chimp, we've got the human, and their common ancestor right here. Now this common ancestor, we don't usually have a name here, right? This is usually, we understand there is a common ancestor of these two. We don't know exactly what it was. And this smaller clade is nested within this larger clade that would include the chimp, the human, and the gorilla. And this clade itself is nested within an even larger clade that includes this common ancestor and the orangutan, gorilla, human, and chimpanzee. And that's the way it usually works. Smaller clades are nested within larger clades. So how do we decide who gets to be in a clade, right? How do we decide who's in a clade together? Well, organisms are grouped into clades based on traits that have been inherited from a common ancestor. And we would refer to these as homologous traits. So homologous traits reveal homology, which is similarity between features due to common descent. So these homologous structures can be either what we call ancestral or derived. Well, first of all, let's just talk about these homologous traits. So all mammals, for example, share the homologous trait of having mammary glands and hair. This trait is homologous because we inherited it from a common ancestor. So these homologous traits might be ancestral, which means they were possessed by the common ancestor. and all the descendants we would refer to these ancestral traits as being plesiomorphic. That's a plesiomorphic trait. So having mammary glands and hair is plesiomorphic. So the fact that a human has mammary glands and hair is plesiomorphic. It is the ancestral trait. It's what our ancestor had. That's why we have it. These are also sometimes known as plesiomorphies. Oh, and I should just kind of clarify for a moment that you can, taxa on the tree can, you know, sort of evolve differently, right? So we could later have had, you know, a lineage that lost hair, you know, or lost mammary glands, and then it would just, that particular group wouldn't have that plesiomorphy anymore. But that doesn't change the fact that hair and mammary glands is the ancestral plesiomorphic trait. Oh, sorry, not done with that one yet. We can also have what are called derived traits. So some homologous traits are derived characters. So a derived trait are possessed by some taxa on the tree, but not all of them, and not by the common ancestor. So this is something that was evolved later. So the derived trait is something that so for example, we had a common ancestor that had mammary glands and hair, but a derived trait, for example, in humans would be the development of a placenta. The common ancestor of everybody on this tree did not have a placenta. This is something that you know, was derived or evolved later on. And so this is said to be the apomorphic state of the character. And we would call these apomorphies. So apomorphies represent a change from the plesiomorphic state to the apomorphic state. There are different types of apomorphies. What we would call a synapomorphy. And when we see syn, that usually means same. Synapomorphies are shared by two or more taxa. So, for example, amnioite egg here would be a synapomorphy of the primates, the rodents, the crocodiles, and the birds. Right? They all share this apomorphy. Synapomorphies are really, really useful when we want to put together clades. And it's one of the main things we look at. There's also something called an autapomorphy. Right? Think auta, self. Right? So this is an apomorphy present only in one taxon. So, for example, feathers would be an autapomorphy of the birds. Only the birds have it. And this can be useful for sort of defining a particular group. It's not as useful for making clades and putting together the tree, however. Okay, so I'm going to end there and pick up later, and see you soon.